Chapter 5, Continued. Arthur Dent was 1,437 light years away, in a sob, and anxious. Behind him in the back seat was a girl who made him crack his head on the door as he climbed in. He didn't know if it was just because she was the first female of his own species that he had laid eyes on in years, or what it was, but he felt stupefied with, "This is absurd," he told himself. "Calm down," he told himself. "You are not," he continued to himself in the firmest internal voice he could muster, "in a fit and rational state. You have just hitchhiked over 100,000 light years across the galaxy. You are very tired, a little confused, and extremely vulnerable. Relax. Don't panic. Concentrate on breathing deeply." He twisted round in his seat. "Are you sure she's all right?" he said again. Beyond the fact that she was, to him, heart-thumpingly beautiful, he could make out very little. How tall she was, how old she was, the exact shading of her hair. And he couldn't ask her anything about herself because, sadly, she was completely unconscious. "She's just drugged," said her brother, shrugging, not moving his eyes from the road ahead. "And that's all right, is it?" said Arthur in alarm. "Suits me," he said. "Ah," said Arthur. He added after a moment's thought. The conversation so far had been going astoundingly badly. After an initial flurry of opening hellos, he and Russell — the wonderful girl's brother's name was Russell, a name which, to Arthur's mind, always suggested burly men with blonde mustaches and blow-dried hair, who would, at the slightest provocation, start wearing velvet tuxedos and frilly shirt fronts, and would then have to be forcibly restrained from commentating on billiard matches, had quickly discovered they didn't like each other at all. Russell was a burly man. He had a blonde mustache. His hair was fine and blow-dried. To be fair to him, though Arthur didn't see any necessity for this beyond the sheer mental exercise of it, he, Arthur, was himself looking pretty grim. A man can't cross 100,000 light years, mostly in other people's baggage compartments, without beginning to fray a little, and Arthur had frayed a lot. "She's not a junkie," said Russell suddenly, as if he clearly thought that someone else in the car might be. "She's under sedation." "But that's terrible," said Arthur, twisting round to look at her again. She seemed to stir slightly, and her head slipped sideways on her shoulder. Her dark hair fell across her face, obscuring it. "What's the matter with her? Is she ill?" "No," said Russell. "Merely barking mad." "What?" said Arthur, horrified. "Loopy, completely bananas. I'm taking her back to the hospital and telling them to have another go. They let her out while she still thought she was a hedgehog." "A hedgehog?" Russell hooted his horn fiercely at a car that came round the corner toward them, halfway across onto their side of the road, making them swerve. The anger seemed to make him feel better. "Well, maybe not a hedgehog," he said after he'd settled down again. "Though it would probably be simpler to deal with if she did. If somebody thinks they're a hedgehog, presumably you just give them a mirror and a few pictures of hedgehogs and tell them to sort it out for themselves. Come down again when they feel better. At least medical science could deal with it, that's the point. Seems that's not good enough for Fenny, though." "Fenny? You know what I got her for Christmas?" "Well, no." "Black's Medical Dictionary." "Nice present." "I thought so. Thousands of diseases in it, all in alphabetical order." "You say her name is Fenny?" "Yeah, take your pick," I said. "Anything in here can be dealt with. The proper drugs can be prescribed. But no, she has to have something different just to make life difficult. She was like that at school, you know." "Was she?" "She was. Fell over playing hockey and broke a bone nobody had ever heard of." "I can see how that would be irritating," said Arthur doubtfully. He was rather disappointed to discover her name was Fenny. It was a rather silly, dispiriting name, such as an unlovely maiden aunt might vote herself if she couldn't sustain the name Fenella properly. "Not that I wasn't sympathetic," continued Russell, "but it did get a bit irritating. She was limping for months." He slowed down. This is your exit, isn't it? No, said Arthur. 5 miles farther on, if that's all right. Okay, said Russell after a very tiny pause to indicate that it wasn't, and speeded up again. It was, in fact, Arthur's exit, but he couldn't leave without finding out something more about this girl who seemed to have taken such a grip on his mind without even waking up. He could take either of the next 2 exits. They led back to the village that had been his home, though what he would find there he hesitated to imagine. Familiar landmarks had been flitting by, ghost-like in the dark, giving rise in him to the shudders that only very, very normal things can create, when seen where the mind is unprepared for them and in an unfamiliar light. By his own personal timescale, so far as he could estimate it, living as he had been under the alien rotations of distant suns, it was 8 years since he had left. But what time had passed here he could hardly guess. Indeed, what events had passed were beyond his exhausted comprehension, because this planet, his home, should not be here. 8 years ago, at lunchtime, this planet had been demolished, utterly destroyed, by the huge yellow Vogon ships which had hung in the lunchtime sky, as if the law of gravity were no more than a local regulation, and breaking it no more than just a parking offense. Delusions, said Russell. What? Said Arthur, startled out of his train of thought. She says she suffers from strange delusions that she's living in the real world. It's no good telling her that she is living in the real world, because she just says that's why the delusions are so strange. Don't know about you, but I find that kind of conversation pretty exhausting. Give her the tablets and piss off for a beer is my answer. I mean, you can only muck about so much, can't you? Arthur frowned, not for the first time. Well, and all this dreams and nightmare stuff, and the doctor's going on about strange jumps in her brainwave patterns. Jumps? This, said Fenny. Arthur whirled around in his seat and stared into her suddenly open but utterly vacant eyes. Whatever she was looking at wasn't in the car. Her eyes fluttered, her head jerked once, and then she was sleeping peacefully. What did she say? He asked nervously. She said, this. This what? This what? How the heck should I know? This hedgehog, that chimney pot, the other pair of Don Alfonso's tweezers. She's barking mad. I thought I'd mentioned that. You don't seem to care very much. Arthur tried to say it as matter-of-factly as possible, but it didn't seem to work. Look, Buster. Okay, I'm sorry. It's none of my business. I didn't mean it to sound like that, said Arthur. I know you care a lot, obviously, he added, lying. I know that you'll have to deal with it somehow. You'll have to excuse me. I just hitched from the other side of the Horsehead Nebula. He stared furiously out the window. He was astonished that, of all the sensations fighting for room in his head on this night as he returned to the home that he thought had vanished into oblivion forever, the one that was compelling him was an obsession with this bizarre girl of whom he knew nothing other than she had said this to him, and that he wouldn't wish her brother on a Vogon. So, what were the jumps, these jumps you mentioned? He went on to say as quickly as he could. Look, this is my sister. I don't even know why I'm talking to you about. Okay, I'm sorry. Perhaps you'd better let me out. This is... At the moment he said it, it became impossible, because the storm which had passed them by suddenly erupted again. Lightning belched through the sky, and someone seemed to be pouring something which closely resembled the Atlantic Ocean over them, through a sieve. Russell swore and steered intently for a few seconds as the sky blattered at them. He worked out his anger by rashly accelerating to pass a lorry marked McKenna's all-weather haulage. The tension eased as the rain subsided. It started out with all that business of the CIA agent they found in the reservoir, when everybody had all the hallucinations and everything, you remember? Arthur wondered for a moment whether to mention again that he had just hitchhiked back from the other side of the Horsehead Nebula, and for this and various other related and astounding reasons, was a little out of touch with recent events. But he decided it would only confuse matters further. No, he said. That was the moment she cracked up. She was in a cafe somewhere, Rickmansworth. Don't know what she was doing there, but that was where she cracked up. Apparently she stood up, calmly announced that she had undergone some extraordinary revelation or something, wobbled a bit, looked confused, and finally collapsed screaming into an egg sandwich. Arthur winced. "I'm very sorry to hear that," he said a little stiffly. Russell made a sort of grumping noise. "So what," said Arthur in an attempt to piece things together, "was the CIA agent doing in the reservoir?" "Bobbing up and down, of course. He was dead." "But what? Come on, you remember all that stuff, the hallucinations. Everyone said it was the CIA experimenting with drug warfare or something. Some crackpot theory that instead of invading a country, it would be much cheaper and more effective to make everyone think they'd been invaded." "What hallucinations were those exactly?" said Arthur in a rather quiet voice. "What do you mean, what hallucinations? I'm talking about all that stuff with the big yellow ships, everyone going crazy and saying we're going to die, and then pop, they vanished as the effect wore off. The CIA denied it, which meant it must be true." Arthur's head went a little swimmy. His hand grabbed at something to steady himself and gripped it tightly. His mouth made little opening and closing movements as if it was on his mind to say something, but nothing emerged. "Anyway," continued Russell, "whatever drug it was didn't seem to wear off so fast with Fenny. I was all for suing the CIA, but a lawyer friend of mine said it would be like trying to attack a lunatic asylum with a banana, so..." He shrugged. "The Vogon," squeaked Arthur. "The yellow ships vanished?" "Well, of course they did. They were hallucinations," said Russell, and looked at Arthur oddly. "You trying to say you don't remember any of this? Where have you been, for heaven's sake?" This was, to Arthur, such an astonishingly good question that he half leaped out of his seat with shock. "Christ!" yelled Russell, fighting to control the car, which was suddenly trying to skid. He pulled it out of the path of an oncoming lorry and swerved up onto a grass bank. As the car lurched to a halt, the girl in the back was thrown against Russell's seat and collapsed awkwardly. Arthur twisted round in horror. "Is she all right?" he blurted out. Russell swept his hands angrily back through his blow-dried hair. He tugged at his blonde mustache. He turned to Arthur. "Would you please," he said, "let go of the handbrake?" Chapter 6. From here, it was a 4-mile walk to his village, a mile farther to the exit, to which the abominable Russell had now fiercely declined to take him, and from there, a farther 3 miles of winding country lane. The sob seethed off into the night. Arthur watched it go, as stunned as a man might be who, having believed himself to be totally blind for 5 years, suddenly discovers that he had merely been wearing too large a hat. He shook his head sharply in the hope that it might dislodge some salient fact which would fall into place and make sense of an otherwise utterly bewildering universe. But since the salient fact, if there was one, entirely failed to do this, he set off up to the road again, hoping that a good vigorous walk and maybe even some good painful blisters would help to reassure him of at least his own existence, if not his sanity. It was 10:30 when he arrived, a fact he discovered from the steamed and greasy window of the Horse and Groom pub, in which there had hung for many years a battered old Guinness clock which featured a picture of an emu with a pint glass jammed rather amusingly down its throat. This was the pub in which he had passed the fatal lunchtime, during which first his house and then the entire earth had been demolished. Or rather had seemed to be demolished. No, damn it, had been demolished, because if they hadn't been, then where the bloody heck had he been for the last 8 years? And how had he got there if not in one of the big yellow Vogon ships, which the appalling Russell had just been telling him were merely drug-induced hallucinations? And yet, if it had been demolished, what was he currently standing on? He jammed the brakes on this line of thought because it wasn't going to get him any further than it had the last 20 times he'd been over it. He started again. This was the pub in which he had passed the fatal lunchtime, during which whatever it was had happened that he was going to sort out later had happened, and it still didn't make sense. He started again. This was the pub in which... This was a pub. Pubs served drinks, and he could certainly do with one. satisfied that his jumbled thought processes had at last arrived at a conclusion, and a conclusion he was happy with, even if it wasn't the one he had set out to achieve, he strode toward the door and stopped. A small black wire-haired terrier ran out from behind a low wall and then, catching sight of Arthur clearly, began to snarl. Now Arthur knew this dog, and he knew it well. It belonged to an advertising friend of his and was called Know-Nothing Bozo, the Non-Wonder Dog, because of the way its hair stood up on its head reminded people of the President of the United States of America. And the dog knew Arthur, or at least it should. It was a stupid dog, but it should have at least been able to recognize Arthur instead of standing there, hackles raised, as if Arthur were the most fearful apparition ever to intrude upon its feeble-witted life. This prompted Arthur to go and peer at the window again, this time with an eye not for the asphyxiating emu, but for himself. Seeing himself for the first time suddenly in a familiar context, he had to admit that the dog had a point. He looked a lot like something a farmer would use to scare birds with, and there was no doubt but that to go into the pub in his present condition would excite comment of a raucous kind, and worse still, there would doubtless be several people in there at the moment whom he knew, all of whom would be bound to bombard him with questions which at the moment he felt ill-equipped to deal with. Will Smithers, for instance, the owner of Know-Nothing Bozo, the Non-Wonder Dog, an animal so stupid that it had been sacked from one of Will's own commercials for being incapable of knowing which dog food it was supposed to prefer, despite the fact that the meat in all the other bowls had engine oil poured all over it. Will would definitely be in there. Here was his dog, there was his car, a gray Porsche 928S with a sign in the back window which read, "My other car is also a Porsche." Damn him. He stared at it and realized that he had just learned something he hadn't known before. Will Smithers, like most of the overpaid and underscrupulous bastards Arthur knew in advertising, made a point of changing his car every August so that he could tell people his accountant made him do it, though the truth was that his accountant was trying like hell to stop him, what with all the alimony he had to pay and so on. And this was the same car Arthur remembered him having before. The number plate proclaimed its year. Given that it was now winter, and that the event which had caused Arthur so much trouble 8 of his personal years ago had occurred at the beginning of September, less than 6 or 7 months could have passed here. He stood terribly still for a moment and let Know-Nothing Bozo jump up and down yapping at him. He was suddenly stunned by a realization he could no longer avoid, which was this. He was now an alien on his own world. Try as they might, no one was even going to be able to believe his story. Not only did it sound perfectly potty, but it was flatly contradicted by the simplest observable facts. Was this really the Earth? Was there the slightest possibility that he had made some extraordinary mistake? The pub in front of him was unbearably familiar to him in every detail, every brick, every piece of peeling paint, and inside he could sense its familiar, stuffy, noisy warmth, its exposed beams, its unauthentic cast iron light fittings, its bar sticky with beer that people he knew had put their elbows in, overlooked by cardboard cutouts of girls with packets of peanuts stapled all over their breasts. It was all the stuff of his home, his world. He even knew this blasted dog. "Hey, Know-Nothing!" The sound of Will Smithers' voice meant he had to decide what to do quickly. If he stood his ground, he would be discovered, and the whole circus would begin. To hide would only postpone the moment, and it was bitterly cold now. The fact that it was Will made the choice easier. It wasn't that Arthur disliked him as such. Will was quite fun. It was just that he was fun in such an exhausting way because, being in advertising, he always wanted you to know how much fun he was having and where he had got his jacket from. Mindful of this, Arthur hid behind a van. "Hey, Know-Nothing! What's up?" The door opened and Will came out wearing a leather flying jacket that he'd got a mate of his at the Road Research Laboratory to crash a car into specially in order to get that battered look. Know-Nothing yelped with delight and, having gotten the attention it wanted, was happy to forget Arthur. Will was with some friends, and they had a game they played with the dog. "Commies!" they all shouted at the dog in chorus. "Commies! Commies! Commies!" The dog went berserk with barking, prancing up and down, yapping its little heart out, beside itself in transports of ecstatic rage. They all laughed and cheered it on, then gradually dispersed to their various cars and disappeared into the night. Well, that clears one thing up, thought Arthur from behind his van. This is quite definitely the planet I remember. Chapter 7. His house was still there. How or why, he had no idea, but he had decided to go and have a look while he was waiting for the pub to empty, so that he could go and ask the landlord for a bed for the night, when everyone else had gone. And there it was. He let himself in with a key he kept under a stone frog in the garden, hurriedly because, astoundingly, the phone was ringing. He had heard it faintly all the way up the lane, and had started to run as soon as he realized where the sound was coming from. The door had to be forced open because of the astonishing accumulation of junk mail on the doormat. It jammed itself stuck on what he would later discover were 14 identical, personally addressed invitations to apply for a credit card he already had, personally addressed non-payment of bills on a credit card he didn't have, 33 identical letters saying that he personally had been very specially selected as a man of taste and discrimination who knew what he wanted and where he was going in today's sophisticated, jet-setting world, and would he therefore like to buy some grotty wallet, and also a dead tabby kitten. He rammed himself through the relatively narrow opening afforded by all this, stumbled through a pile of wine offers that no discriminating connoisseur would want to miss, slithered over a heap of beach villa holidays, blundered up the dark stairs to his bedroom, and got to the phone just as it stopped ringing. He collapsed, panting, onto his cold, musty-smelling bed, and for a few minutes stopped trying to prevent the world from spinning round his head in the way it obviously wanted to. When it had enjoyed its little spin and had calmed down a bit, Arthur reached out for the bedside light, not expecting it to come on. To his surprise, it did. This appealed to Arthur's sense of logic. Since the electricity board had cut him off without fail every time he paid his bill, it seemed only reasonable that they should leave him connected when he hadn't. Sending them money obviously only drew attention to himself. The room was much as he had left it, festeringly untidy, though the effect was muted a little by a thick layer of dust. Half-read books and magazines nestled among piles of half-used towels, half pairs of socks reclined in half-drunk cups of coffee. What once had been a half-eaten sandwich had now half-turned into something that Arthur didn't entirely want to know about. Flung a fork of lightning through the slot, he thought to himself, and you'd start the evolution of life all over again. There was only one thing in the room that was different. For a moment or so, he couldn't see what the one thing that was different was, because it was too covered in a film of disgusting dust. Then his eyes caught it and stopped. It was next to a battered old television on which it was only possible to watch Open University study courses, because if it tried to show anything more exciting, it would break down. It was a box. Arthur pushed himself up on his elbows and peered at it. It was a gray box, with a kind of dull luster to it. It was a cubical gray box, just over a foot on one side. It was tied with a single gray ribbon, knotted into a neat bow on the top. He got up, walked over, and touched it in surprise. Whatever it was clearly gift-wrapped neatly and beautifully, and was waiting for him to open it. Cautiously, he picked it up and carried it back to the bed. He brushed the dust off the top and loosened the ribbon. The top of the box was a lid with a flap tucked into the body of the box. He untucked it and looked into the box. In it was a glass globe, nestling in fine gray tissue paper. He drew it out carefully. It wasn't a proper globe because it was open at the bottom, or, as Arthur realized turning it over, at the top with a thick rim. It was a bowl. A fish bowl. It was made of the most wonderful glass, perfectly transparent, yet with an extraordinary silver-gray quality, as if crystal and slate had gone into its making. Arthur slowly turned it over and over in his hands. It was one of the most beautiful objects he had ever seen, but he was entirely perplexed by it. He looked into the box, but other than the tissue paper, there was nothing. On the outside of the box, there was nothing. He turned the bowl round again. It was wonderful. It was exquisite. But it was a fishbowl. He tapped it with his thumbnail, and it rang with a deep and glorious chime, which was sustained for longer than seemed possible, and when at last it faded, seemed not to die away, but to drift off into other worlds, as into a deep sea dream. Entranced, Arthur turned it round yet again, and this time the light from the dusty little bedside lamp caught it at a different angle and glittered on some fine abrasions on the fishbowl's surface. He held it up, adjusting the angle to the light, and suddenly saw clearly the finely engraved shapes of words shadowed on the glass. "So long," they said, "and thanks." And that was all. He blinked and understood nothing. For fully 5 more minutes, he turned the object around and around, held it to the light at different angles, tapped it for its mesmerizing chime, and pondered on the meaning of the shadowy letters, but could find none. Finally, he stood up, filled the bowl with water from the tap, and put it back on the table next to the television. He shook the little battlefish from his ear and dropped it, wriggling, into the bowl. He wouldn't be needing it anymore except for watching foreign movies. He returned to lie on his bed and turned out the light. He lay still and quiet. He absorbed the enveloping darkness, slowly relaxed his limbs from end to end, eased and regulated his breathing, gradually cleared his mind of all thought, closed his eyes, and was completely incapable of getting to sleep. The night was uneasy with rain. The rain clouds themselves had now moved on and were currently concentrating their attention on a small cafe just outside Bournemouth. But the sky through which they had passed had been disturbed by them, and now wore a damply ruffled air, as if it didn't know what else it might do if it didn't know what else it might not do if further provoked. The moon was out in a watery way. It looked like a ball of paper from the back pocket of jeans that had just come from the washing machine, which only time and ironing would tell if it was an old shopping list or a 5-pound note. The wind flicked about a little, like the tail of a horse that's trying to decide what sort of mood it's in tonight, and a bell somewhere chimed midnight. A skylight creaked open. It was stiff and had to be jiggled and persuaded a little because the frame was slightly rotten, and the hinge had, at some time in its life, been rather sensibly painted over. But eventually it was opened. A strut was found to prop it, and a figure struggled out into the narrow gully between the opposing pitches of the roof. The figure stood and watched the sky in silence. The figure was completely unrecognizable as the wild-looking creature who had burst crazily into the cottage a little over an hour ago. Gone was the ragged, threadbare dressing gown, smeared with the mud of 100 worlds, stained with junk food condiment from 100 grimy spaceports. Gone was the tangled mane of hair, gone the long and knotted beard, flourishing ecostructure and all. Instead, there was Arthur Dent, smooth and casual in corduroys and a bulky sweater. His hair was cropped and washed, his chin clean-shaven. Only the eyes still said that whatever it was the universe thought it was doing to him, he would still like it, please, to stop. They were not the same eyes with which he had last looked out at this particular scene, and the brain which interpreted the images the eyes resolved was not the same brain. There had been no surgery involved, just the continual wrenching of experience. The night seemed like an alive thing to him at this moment, the dark earth around him, a being in which he was rooted. He could feel like a tingle on distant nerve ends, the flood of a far river, the roll of invisible hills, the knot of heavy rain clouds parked somewhere away to the south. He could sense, too, the thrill of being a tree, which was something he hadn't expected. He knew that it felt good to curl your toes in the earth, but he'd never realized it could feel quite as good as that. He could sense an almost unseemly wave of pleasure reaching at him all the way from the New Forest. He must try this summer, he thought, to see what having leaves felt like. From another direction, he felt the sensation of being a sheep startled by a flying saucer, but it was virtually indistinguishable from the feeling of being a sheep startled by anything else it ever encountered, for they were creatures who learned very little on their journey through life and would be startled to see the sun rising in the morning and astonished by all the green stuff in the fields. He was surprised to find he could feel the sheep being startled by the sun that morning, and the morning before, and being startled by a clump of trees the day before that. He could go further and further back, but it got dull because all it consisted of was sheep being startled by things they'd been startled by the day before. He left the sheep and let his mind drift outwardly, sleepily, in developing ripples. It felt the presence of other minds, hundreds of them, thousands in a web, some sleepy, some sleeping, some terribly excited, one fractured. He passed it fleetingly and tried to feel for it again, but it eluded him like the other card with an apple on it in a memory course. He felt a spasm of excitement because he knew instinctively who it was, or at least knew who it was he wanted it to be. And once you know what it is you want to be true, instinct is a very useful device for enabling you to know that it is. He instinctively knew that it was Fenny and that he wanted to find her, but he could not. By straining too much for it, he could feel he was losing this strange new faculty, so he relaxed the search and let his mind wander easily once more. And again, he felt the fracture. Again, he couldn't find it. This time, whatever his instincts were busy telling him it was all right to believe, he wasn't certain that it was Fenny. Or perhaps it was a different fracture this time. It had the same disjointed quality, but it seemed a more general feeling of fracture. Deeper, not a single mind, maybe not a mind at all. It was different. He let his mind sink slowly and widely into the earth, rippling, seeping, sinking. He was following the earth through its days, drifting with the rhythms of its myriad pulses, seeping through the webs of its life, swelling with its tides, turning with its weight. Always the fracture kept returning, a dull, disjointed, distant ache. And now he was flying through a land of light. The light was time, the tides of it were days receding. The fracture he had sensed, the second fracture, lay in the distance before him across the land, the thickness of a single hair across the dreaming landscape of the days of earth. And suddenly he was upon it. He danced dizzily over the edge as the dreamland dropped sheer away beneath him, a stupefying precipice into nothing, him wildly twisting, clawing at nothing, flailing in horrifying space, spinning, falling. Across the jagged chasm had been another land, another time, an older world, not fractured from, but hardly joined. Two earths. He woke. A cold breeze brushed the feverish sweat standing on his forehead. The nightmare was spent, and so, he felt, was he. His shoulders drooped. He gently rubbed his eyes with the tips of his fingers. At last he was sleepy as well as very tired. As to what it meant, if it meant anything at all, he would think about in the morning. For now, he would go to bed and sleep. His own bed, his own sleep. He could see his house in the distance and wondered why this was. It was silhouetted against the moonlight, and he recognized its rather dull, blockish shape. He looked about him and noticed that he was about 18 inches above the rose bushes of one of his neighbors, John Ainsworth. His rose bushes were carefully tended, pruned back for the winter, strapped to canes and labeled, and Arthur wondered what he was doing above them. He wondered what was holding him there, and when he discovered that nothing was holding him there, he crashed awkwardly to the ground. He picked himself up, brushed himself down, and hobbled back to his house on a sprained ankle. He undressed and toppled into bed. While he was asleep, the phone rang again. It rang for fully 15 minutes and caused him to turn over twice. It never, however, stood a chance of waking him up. Chapter 8. Arthur awoke feeling wonderful, absolutely fabulous, refreshed, overjoyed to be home, bouncing with energy, hardly disappointed at all to discover it was the middle of February. He almost danced to the fridge, found the 3 least hairy things in it, put them on a plate, and watched them intently for 2 minutes. Since they made no attempt to move within that time, he called them breakfast and ate them. Between them, they killed a virulent space disease he'd picked up without knowing it in the Flargathan gas swamps a few days earlier, which otherwise would have killed off half the population of the Western Hemisphere, blinded the other half, and driven everyone else psychotic and sterile, so the Earth was lucky there. He felt strong. He felt healthy. He vigorously cleared away the junk mail with a spade and then buried the cat. Just as he was finishing that, the phone rang. But he let it ring while he maintained a moment's respectful silence. Whoever it was would ring back if it was important. He kicked the mud off his shoes and went back inside. There had been a small number of significant letters in the piles of junk. Some documents from the council dated 3 years earlier relating to the proposed demolition of his house, and some other letters about the setting up of a public inquiry into the whole bypass scheme in the area. There was also an old letter from Greenpeace, the ecological pressure group to which he occasionally made contributions, asking for help with their scheme to release dolphins and orcas from captivity, and some postcards from friends vaguely complaining that he never got in touch these days. He collected these things together and put them in a cardboard file, which he marked, "Things to do." Since he was feeling so vigorous and dynamic that morning, he even added the word, "urgent." He unpacked his towel and another few odd bits and pieces from the plastic bag he had acquired at the Port Bresta Megamart. The slogan on the side was a clever and elaborate pun in lingua centauri, which was completely incomprehensible in any other language, and therefore entirely pointless for a duty-free shop at a spaceport. The bag also had a hole in it, so he threw it away. He realized with a sudden twinge that something else must have dropped out in the small spacecraft that had brought him to Earth, kindly going out of its way to drop him right beside the A303. He had lost his battered and space-worn copy of the thing which had helped him find his way across the unbelievable wastes of space he had traversed. He had lost the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Well, he told himself, this time I really won't be needing it again. He had some calls to make. He had decided how to deal with the massive contradictions his return journey precipitated, which was that he would simply brazen it out. He phoned the BBC and asked to be put through to his department head. "Oh, hello, Arthur Dent here. Look, sorry I haven't been in for 6 months, but I've gone mad." "Oh, not to worry. Thought it was probably something like that. Happens here all the time. How soon can we expect you?" "When do hedgehogs start hibernating?" "Sometime in the spring, I think." "I'll be in shortly after that." "Righty-ho." He flipped through the yellow pages and made a short list of numbers to try. "Oh, hello. Is that the Old Elms Hospital? Yes, I was just phoning to see if I could have a word with Fenella. Good Lord, silly me. I'll forget my own name next. Fenella. Isn't this ridiculous? Patient of yours, dark-haired girl, came in last night." "I'm afraid we don't have any patients called Fenella." "Oh, don't you? I meant Fiona, of course. What, we just call her I'm sorry, goodbye." Click. 6 conversations along these lines began to take their toll on his mood of vigorous, dynamic optimism, and he decided that before it deserted him entirely, he would take it down to the pub and parade it a little. He had the perfect idea for explaining away every inexplicable weirdness about himself at a stroke, and he whistled as he pushed open the door which had so daunted him last night. "Arthur!" He grinned cheerfully at the boggling eyes that stared at him from all corners of the pub, and told them all what a wonderful time he'd had in Southern California. Chapter 9. He accepted another pint and took a pull at it. "Of course, I had my own personal alchemist, too." "You what?" He was getting silly, and he knew it. Exuberance and Holland Woodhouse best bidder was a mixture to be wary of. But one of the first effects it had is to stop you being wary of things. And the point at which Arthur should have stopped and explained no more was the point at which he had started instead to get inventive. "Oh, yes," he insisted with a happy glazed smile. "It's why I've lost so much weight." "What?" said his audience. "Oh, yes," he said again. "The Californians have rediscovered alchemy, oh yes." He smiled again. "Only," he said, "it's in a much more useful form than that which in—" He paused thoughtfully to let a little grammar assemble in his head. In which the ancients used to practice it, or at least, he added, failed to practice it. They couldn't get it to work, you know. Nostradamus and that lot couldn't cut it. Nostradamus, said one of his audience. I didn't think he was an alchemist, said another. I thought, said a third, he was a seer. He became a seer, said Arthur to his audience, the component parts of which were beginning to bob and blur a little, because he was such a lousy alchemist. You should know that. He took another pull at his beer. It was something he had not tasted for 8 years. He tasted it and tasted it. What has alchemy got to do, asked a bit of the audience, with losing weight? I'm glad you asked that, said Arthur, very glad. And I will now tell you what the connection is between, he paused, between those two things, the things you mentioned. I'll tell you. He paused and maneuvered his thoughts. It was like watching oil tankers do 3-point turns in the English Channel. They've discovered how to turn excess body fat into gold, he said in a sudden blurt of coherence. You're kidding. Oh, yes, he said. No, he corrected himself. They have. He rounded on the doubting part of his, on the doubting part of his audience, which was all of it, and so it took a little while to round on it completely. Have you been to California? He demanded. Do you know the sort of stuff they do there? 3 members of his audience said they had, and that he was talking nonsense. You haven't seen anything, insisted Arthur. Oh, yes, he added, because someone was offering to pay another round. The evidence, he said, pointing at himself, and not missing by more than a couple of inches, is before your eyes. 14 hours in a trance, he said. In a tank. In a trance. I was in a tank, I think, he added after a thoughtful pause. I already said that. He waited patiently while the next round was duly distributed. He composed the next bit of his story in his mind, which was going to be something about the tank needing to be oriented along a line dropped perpendicularly from the pole star to a baseline drawn between Mars and Venus. He was about to start trying to say it when he decided to give it a miss. Long time, he said instead, in a tank, in a trance. He looked round severely at his audience to make sure it was all following attentively. He resumed. Where was I? He said. In a trance, said one. In a tank, said another. Oh yes, said I. Thank you. And slowly, he said, pressing on her. Slowly, slowly, slowly. All your excess body fat turns to... He paused for effect. Subcutaneous. He paused for a breath. Subcutaneous gold, which you can have surgically removed. Getting out of the tank is hell. What did you say? I was just clearing my throat. I think you doubt me. I was clearing my throat. She was clearing her throat, confirmed a significant part of the audience in a low rumble. Oh yes, said Arthur, all right. And then you split the proceeds. He paused again for a math break. 50-50 with the alchemist. Make a lot of money. He looked swayingly around at his audience and could not help but be aware of an air of skepticism about their jumbled faces. He felt very affronted by this. How else, he demanded, could I afford to have my face dropped? Friendly arms began to help him home. Listen, he protested as the cold February breeze brushed his face. Looking lived in is all the rage in California at the moment. You've got to look as if you've seen the galaxy. Life, I mean. You've got to look as if you've seen life. That's what I got. A face drop. Give me 8 years, I said. I hope being 30 doesn't come back into fashion or I've wasted a lot of money. He lapsed into silence for a while as the friendly arms continued to help him along the lane to his house. Got in yesterday, he mumbled. I'm very, very, very happy to be home. Or somewhere very like it. Jet lag, muttered one of his friends. Long trip from California. Really mucks you up for a couple of days. I don't think he's been there at all, muttered another. Wonder where he has been. What's happened to him? After a little sleep, Arthur got up and pottered around the house a bit. He felt woozy and a little low, still disoriented by the journey. He wondered how he was going to find Finny. He sat and looked at the fishbowl. He tapped it again, and despite being full of water and a small yellow babblefish, which was gulping its way around rather dejectedly, it still chimed its deep and resonant chime as clearly and mesmerically as before. Someone is trying to thank me, he thought to himself. He wondered who, and for what.